Hello everyone. Welcome to Story Hub channel. Discover real stories of wife betrayals, shocking twists and turns and their secrets. Hit the subscribe button and get to our story. Megan never imagined her life would take such a turn. What once seemed like a stable existence, neatly packaged within the bounds of marriage and routine, had now transformed into a suffocating cycle. One where neglect and loneliness were her constant companions. Greg, her husband, had once been the man she dreamt of. But now he was more like a phantom haunting their house, always preoccupied, perpetually distant. Their conversations had dwindled to the mundane: bills, groceries, and schedules. The spark they once shared had faded, leaving Megan yearning for something, anything, to make her feel alive again. And that's when she discovered the chat room. It was a late night, with Greg asleep beside her, as usual, his back turned away. Megan, restless and unable to sleep, turned to her laptop, searching for a distraction from the emptiness gnawing at her insides. That's when she stumbled upon a chat room with a name that immediately drew her in: The Hidden Flame. She hesitated for just a moment, her finger hovering over the mouse, but then she clicked, and her life took a turn she could never have predicted. The conversation started off innocently enough, just light-hearted chatter with strangers, a way to kill time. But then he messaged her, a man with a screen name that sent chills down her spine: Night Shadow. His words were smooth, almost hypnotic, pulling her in like a moth to a flame. They began talking regularly, and soon their exchanges turned flirtatious. Megan found herself eagerly anticipating their conversations, the way he made her feel desired, wanted, and, most importantly, alive. He awakened a longing in her that had been dormant for years, a hunger, a deep-seated need. Days turned into weeks, and their messages grew more intense, more provocative. The thrill of their secret exchanges was intoxicating, and Megan found herself unable to resist. She knew it was wrong, knew she was toying with danger, but she couldn't help herself. Each message from him sent a thrill through her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Then, after a particularly harsh argument with Greg, where he accused her of being too clingy, too demanding, Megan made a choice that would alter everything. She was tired of being overlooked, tired of feeling invisible. She wanted to feel something again, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. With trembling hands, she messaged Night Shadow and agreed to meet him. He provided an address in a part of town unfamiliar to her, a place as enigmatic as the man himself. As she dressed provocatively, her heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. Was this really happening? Was she really about to betray her marriage vows for a man she'd never even met? But as she stepped out into the night, the thrill of the unknown overpowered her fear. She needed this, needed to feel alive once more. The alley was dark, lit only by a flickering streetlight at the far end. Megan's footsteps echoed off the brick walls as she ventured deeper into the shadows, her breath quick and shallow with nerves. She clutched her phone tightly, rereading his last message: "I'll be waiting for you." And then she saw him. He was taller than she had imagined, his form cloaked in darkness. But something about the way he stood, the way he moved, sent a shiver of anticipation through her. He stepped closer, and the dim light revealed his face. A rugged, dangerous-looking man with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, took her hand, and pulled her close. Megan's heart pounded as his touch sent waves of shivers down her spine. She could feel the warmth of his body, the strength in his grip. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning in closer, yearning for his touch. He pressed her gently but firmly against the cold brick wall, his hands roaming her body with a confidence that both thrilled and terrified her. There was no hesitation in his actions, no doubt. His hands slipped under her clothes, exploring her in ways that made her forget everything: her marriage, her guilt, even her own name. The sensations were overwhelming, drowning out the voice in her head that insisted this was wrong. All she could focus on was the pleasure, the way he made her feel desired, wanted. As his fingers moved inside her, Megan's world narrowed to the intense sensations flooding her body. She was lost, completely enveloped by the intensity of the moment. Her wedding vows, her life with Greg. All of it blurred into the background, overtaken by the raw, primal need that had seized her. What Megan didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Greg had been suspicious for a while. He wasn't as unaware as she had assumed. He had noticed the changes in her, the way she seemed distant, preoccupied. And so, in a moment of doubt, he had secretly installed a hidden camera in her car, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever, or whoever, was drawing her away from him. That camera was recording now, capturing every moment of her betrayal, every gasp, every moan, every expression of pleasure on her face. It was all being documented, stored away for Greg to find later. But in that shadowy alley, Megan was oblivious. She was too lost in the moment, too consumed by the stranger's touch to grasp the full scope of the trap she had fallen into. And as she surrendered to the pleasure, as she allowed herself to be taken in ways she had never imagined, she had no idea that her life was on the verge of an irreversible change. The next morning, Megan's mind was a storm of forbidden pleasure and crushing guilt. As she lay in bed, the memories of the dark alley played in her mind like a film she couldn't stop replaying. The stranger's touch, the way he made her feel alive, had been so intoxicating. But now, in the harsh light of day, the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a heavy burden. She tried to shove the thoughts aside, tried to focus on the mundane morning routine, making coffee, preparing breakfast. But her hands trembled as she went through the motions. Greg was already up, sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through the news on his tablet. Megan watched him from the corner of her eye, her heart racing in her chest. Every time he looked up, a spike of fear shot through her. What if he knew? What if he suspected something? She had never been good at hiding her emotions, and now the guilt was written all over her face. But Greg didn't say anything out of the ordinary. In fact, he seemed unusually attentive, asking her about her plans for the day, complimenting her on how she looked. His words felt like daggers, each one twisting the guilt deeper into her heart. Why was he being so kind? Did he know something? The thought gnawed at her all day, turning her stomach into a knot of anxiety. As the day dragged on, Megan's mind became a battleground of guilt and fear. She couldn't concentrate on anything, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the night before, the way the stranger had touched her, the way she had given in so easily. It consumed her every thought. But beneath the surface, another fear was growing like a dark shadow. What if Greg found out? What if he already knew? That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed something off about Greg's demeanor. He was calm, almost too calm, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He asked me about my day, about where I'd been, but his tone was casual, almost teasing. "Did you go anywhere interesting today?" he asked, his gaze never leaving mine. My heart skipped a beat. "No," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just the usual errands." Greg nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "I see. You didn't happen to run into anyone unexpected?" The question hung in the air like a noose tightening around my throat. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "No, nothing like that." But Greg's smile didn't waver. "Good. It's always best to avoid surprises." My hands trembled as I picked up my glass, my mind racing. Was he hinting at something? Did he know? The fear gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing minute. I could barely eat, the food turning to ash in my mouth. All I wanted was to escape, to run from the suffocating tension that filled the room. Over the next few days, Greg's behavior became increasingly unsettling. He'd make offhand remarks about trust and honesty, his words laced with a subtle menace that sent chills down my spine. He'd ask me where I'd been, what I'd done, but always in that same casual, almost playful manner. It was as if he was toying with me, a game that I was terrified of losing. My anxiety spiraled out of control. I started checking my phone obsessively, deleting messages and clearing my browser history. Every time Greg looked at me, It felt like he could see right through me, like he knew every dark secret I was trying so desperately to hide. My behavior only seemed to make Greg more suspicious, feeding into whatever twisted plan he had in mind. One evening, after another tense dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. I retreated to the bedroom, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my messages, making sure there was nothing incriminating left behind. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest, Greg appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Megan, can you come downstairs for a moment? I want to show you something," he said, his voice calm and even. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and followed him down to the living room. Greg walked over to the TV, remote in hand, and turned it on. The screen flickered to life, but instead of the usual news or sports, a video started playing. My blood ran cold as I saw myself on the screen. The alleyway, the stranger, the way I had surrendered to him. It was all there, captured in excruciating detail. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away from the footage. The sounds, the movements, everything was laid bare for Greg to see. Greg stood beside me, his expression eerily calm. He didn't say a word as the video played, just watched my reaction with a detached curiosity. I felt like I was drowning, my mind spinning as the reality of the situation crashed down on me. He knew. He had known all along. When the video finally ended, I couldn't bring myself to look at Greg. The shame, the guilt, it was overwhelming. I felt like I was going to be sick, like the ground was going to swallow me whole. But Greg didn't explode in anger. He didn't yell or scream. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice a cold whisper in my ear. "You thought you could hide this from me? You thought I wouldn't find out?" His words were like ice, freezing me in place. "You're going to pay for what you've done, Megan, and trust me, you have no idea what I have in store for you." His calmness was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could have been. My mind raced with the possibilities, the ways Greg could make me suffer. I was trapped, ensnared in a web of my own making with no escape in sight. And as I stood there trembling in the living room, I knew that my life was about to turn into a living nightmare. Greg's revenge had only just begun, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My world had become a twisted nightmare. The revelation of my betrayal had unleashed a chain of events that I could never have predicted. Greg's calm, icy demeanor as he showed me the footage of my infidelity had been horrifying enough. But what followed was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Greg didn't shout or lash out. Instead, he wielded the footage like a weapon, a tool to bend me to his will. The next morning, he sat me down at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable as he laid out his demands. "You're going to keep seeing him," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And you're going to do exactly what I tell you." My blood ran cold. I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. "Greg, please, I'm sorry. Sorry?" Greg cut me off, his eyes narrowing. "You think sorry is going to fix this? No, Megan. You're going to pay for what you've done. And if you don't, I'll make sure everyone sees that video. Your friends, your family, your coworkers, everyone." The threat hung in the air like a guillotine blade, ready to drop. My mind raced, panic setting in as I desperately tried to think of a way out. But there was none. Greg had me cornered, and he knew it. Desperate to protect my reputation, I had no choice but to agree. The first meeting with the stranger after Greg's ultimatum was pure hell. The thrill I had once felt was gone, replaced by a sickening dread. I felt like I was walking into a trap, knowing that Greg was watching, controlling my every move. The stranger, unaware of the twisted game being played around him, pushed me further each time, his demands growing more degrading by the day. And each time I complied, feeling my soul wither a little more with every act. After each encounter, Greg would demand that I recount every sordid detail. He forced me to relive the humiliation, the shame, and he recorded my confessions, adding them to his growing collection of blackmail material. The cruelty of it all was beyond anything I had ever experienced. I was trapped in a vicious cycle, one that I couldn't escape. As the days turned into weeks, my double life began to take its toll. I became a hollow shell of my former self, my once vibrant personality fading into a constant state of anxiety and fear. The strain on my mental and physical health was undeniable. I stopped sleeping, tormented by nightmares that left me waking in cold sweats. My appetite vanished, leaving me weak and pale. At work, my performance plummeted, my mind too consumed by the horror of my situation to focus on anything else. My coworkers noticed the change, whispering behind my back, speculating about what might be wrong. But I avoided them, terrified that they might see through me, might notice the cracks in the facade I was desperately trying to maintain. Social interactions became unbearable, each one a painful reminder of the life I had lost, the person I used to be. Greg saw the toll it was taking on me, and rather than offering any comfort, he used it to further isolate me. He began subtly encouraging me to quit my job, to cut ties with my friends, feeding my insecurities until I was completely dependent on him. He became my only confidant, the one person I could turn to, even though he was the one causing my pain. It was a twisted dependency, one that left me feeling trapped and powerless, unable to see any way out. Each day, I sank deeper into despair, the weight of my double life crushing me. The guilt, the shame, the fear. It was all consuming, leaving me with nothing but the grim reality that this was my new existence. A life under Greg's control, where every move I made was dictated by him, and every encounter with the stranger was another nail in the coffin of my soul. My world had become a prison, one that I had built with my own hands, and there was no escape. The woman I once was had vanished, replaced by a hollow shell, a puppet in Greg's cruel game. And as the days dragged on, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The nightmare that had become my life was about to take an even darker turn. Greg's revenge, already insidious, was about to escalate into something far more brutal and public. The day began like any other, with me trapped in the routine that had become my prison. But I sensed something different in Greg's demeanor, a coldness that went beyond his usual detached cruelty. "Tonight," Greg announced over breakfast, his tone casual, as if he were discussing dinner plans. "You'll be meeting him again, but this time it's going to be a bit more public." My heart sank. I didn't need to ask what he meant. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Fear gripped me, but I knew better than to protest. Any sign of resistance would only make things worse. So I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where?" "A hotel," Greg replied, sliding a piece of paper across the table with the address. "I've already made the arrangements. And Megan, don't even think about backing out. There will be people watching, people who expect a show." I swallowed hard, the implications of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. Greg's colleagues, perhaps even his superiors, would be there, watching my most private and humiliating moments. The thought made my stomach turn, but I knew I had no choice. The video was still hanging over me like a guillotine, ready to drop if I disobeyed. That evening, I dressed with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. The outfit Greg had laid out for me was revealing, designed to leave nothing to the imagination. I felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, my fear and humiliation choking me as I made my way to the hotel. The room was as cold and sterile as I felt inside. The stranger was already there, waiting for me with that same dangerous look in his eyes. But this time, there was something different. Cameras, strategically placed around the room, their red lights blinking like the eyes of some predatory creature. The door closed behind me with a finality that made my blood run cold. I knew that Greg's colleagues were on the other side, watching through the hidden feed. Every move, every touch, every gasp would be scrutinized and judged by men I barely knew, but who would now know me in the most intimate and degrading way possible. As the stranger approached, I forced myself to go through the motions. I had no choice. The humiliation was unbearable, but the fear of what would happen if I refused was even worse. The encounter was mechanical, devoid of any emotion except for the dread that weighed on me like lead. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the cameras knowing that Greg and his colleagues were watching my every move. When it was finally over, I felt completely hollowed out, like there was nothing left of me but an empty shell. I dressed in silence, my mind numb to the reality of what had just transpired. But as I opened the door to leave, I was met by Greg's cold, calculating gaze. He didn't say a word as he led me out of the hotel, his grip on my arm firm and unyielding. Back at home, Greg wasted no time confronting me. He played the footage on the living room TV, just as he had before, but this time his words were even more cutting. "You were quite the performer tonight," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "My colleagues were very impressed. They couldn't stop talking about how well you followed instructions." My stomach churned at his words. The humiliation was unbearable, but the worst part was realizing that this was only the beginning. Greg made it clear that he wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. He was going to make me suffer in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of degradation and despair. Greg's demands grew more twisted, more depraved, pushing me to my breaking point. Each act was more humiliating than the last, each one recorded for Greg's sick pleasure. I was no longer a person in my own right. I was a pawn in Greg's twisted game, a tool for his revenge. But the final act of humiliation came when Greg forced me to host a dinner party for our friends. He made sure that every guest had seen the footage, that they all knew exactly what I had done, and what I was being forced to do. The evening was a torture of whispered conversations and judgmental glances, each one a dagger to my already shattered self-esteem. I moved through the evening in a daze, my mind numb to the horror of my situation. I could see the pity in some of their eyes, the disgust in others, but all I could do was smile and pretend that everything was normal. I had become an expert at wearing a mask, hiding the brokenness inside from the world. As the night wore on, I felt the last remnants of my self-worth slip away. I was no longer the woman I had once been. I was nothing more than a puppet, dancing to Greg's twisted tune. And as I cleared the dishes and said goodbye to our guests, I knew that there was no escape from the hell my life had become. Greg's revenge was far from over, and I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The woman I had once been was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, a broken doll that Greg could manipulate and control at will. And as the door closed on the last guest, I knew that my suffering was only just beginning.